Hello, everyone. I'm Victoria Schlesinger, the editor of Bay Nature magazine. Thanks for joining us during your lunch hour today. We are going to be talking about coho salmon in the Russian River today. And for those of you who are new to Bay Nature, we are an independent nonprofit media organization that is solely dedicated to reporting on the environment in the greater San Francisco Bay Area. Before we get started with our talk today and introducing folks, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping. We have, so if you have technical difficulties today for some reason, it's not working, you're missing the talk, rest assured that we're going to follow up with a link to a recording of this video so you can watch it later. And if you have questions during the talk, please use the chat or the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. We'll collect your questions and then turn to them probably in the last 20 minutes or so of the conversation. We'll have the main panel for the first 35 to 45 minutes. And I want to give a special shout out to the Lagunitas Community School, who I hear is in attendance today and listening. Good for all of you for joining us. And I love hearing that we have a broad age range of listeners. So with that, I'm going to introduce our panelists. And I am thrilled to introduce Alastair Bland, who is an environmental journalist living in Sonoma County. His reporting has been published in Cal Matters, Hakai, Smithsonian Magazine, and of course, Bay Nature. He wrote the feature, The Last Best Hope for Coho, local coho, excuse me, and that was in Bay Nature's winter issue, and of course is the basis of our conversation today. Welcome, Alastair. Also introducing John Green, who is a fluvial geomorphologist and has been a lead scientist with the Gold Ridge Resource Conservation District in Sonoma County for almost 15 years and worked in the same fields for many years prior to that. RCDs, for those of you who don't know what they are, and maybe John, you can join in later and say a little bit more, but RCDs are special districts set up throughout the state of California in communities, and they provide those communities with technical information on how to best manage their natural resources. They're really special and unique entities. And finally, I'm delighted to introduce Sarah Nossaman Pierce, who is a marine habitat specialist with NOAA, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration. She's with their Restoration Center, which is based in their Santa Rosa office. She's been working in various capacities to support Central California coast salmon and steelhead recovery for more than 25 years. And she's actually NOAA's technical monitor for the work that we're going to be talking about today specifically. So welcome, John. Welcome, Sarah. I really appreciate it. And since we have a lot to talk about today, I'm just going to dive right in. And we're going to start with just a quick overview to make sure everybody who's listening is on the same page with us. So we're going to start with the super basics. And Sarah, could you just start out by telling us what salmonid is and which species are found in the Russian River?
Sure thing. Hi, Victoria and the whole Bay Nature community. Thank you so much for having me on today. This is exciting and fun. Salmonids are simply fish in the family Salmonidae. So that includes salmon, trout, char, and whitefishes. And in the Russian River, we have 3 species of native salmonids. We have endangered coho salmon, threatened Chinook salmon, and threatened steelhead trout.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then Alastair, in your story for Bay Nature, you did a really lovely job of describing kind of why, of all the places that these species live along the California coast, why are we talking about the Russian River and coho there?
Well, the Russian River historically was a huge salmon producer, a steelhead trout as well, and it was prolific. It was famous. It was an angling destination, um, and it's sort of hard to imagine now for people who know the river because it's so comparatively sterile compared to what it once was. But the stories are just amazing of how many fish went up the stream, and it was a stronghold for the Central California coast, Coho. And statewide of perhaps 500,000 to a million coho historically from Santa Cruz County
Wow.
north, there were probably 10% to 20% roughly that spawned in the Russian River. So it was a huge contributor to the
Yeah.
statewide population.
Yeah.
And briefly, there's something interesting about the range of coho in California. It overlaps pretty closely with redwood trees, and that's not a coincidence. That's because
Sarah's backgrounds, which is quite beautiful.
oh yeah, um, it's it's the redwoods do for the coastal watersheds what snowpack does for the high Sierra, where the tributaries to the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers begin. The redwoods capture fog on their needles. They drop it to the ground, and it's basically precipitation in the driest months of the year. And so it's this amazing ecosystem service. It keeps what would otherwise be an arid watershed um, uh, lush and green and well watered, and it created these perennial streams, which were once amazing habitat for salmon.
Yeah, cool. Thank you. Um, and John, I hate to give you the depressing question, but yeah, kind of can you tell us just a little bit about what it's like today for the fish we're talking about for coho?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for having me on today.
Yeah.
Populations of all salmonids, especially in the Russian River, but throughout their range, have been crashing over, the last 30 to 40 years. And it's really a combination of factors that have led to this, with destruction and degradation of habitat that kind of playing the leading role. Our focus at the RCD has been on coho salmon and steelhead trout. They spawn and rear in streams and creeks rather than in the main stem rivers. So we're looking at these small streams that flow out of the hills and flow into the Russian River. Um, all of these habitats have been impacted by all the things that we do on the land. Things like like channelization and levee building in the floodplains, but also the impacts of human settlement, of European settlement in throughout the watersheds of these streams. So it's important to think of the stream as being a product of its watershed. So it's not
Mm.
just the stuff that we do to the creek itself, but it's the land all around it that feeds the watershed. And I thought Alastair's reference to the redwoods playing this role similar to what the snowpack plays in the Sierra was a really good one because it kind of demonstrates that redwood forest throughout the range of the Coho is providing all these different habitat conditions. So we've done all these things on the land over the last 150 years. We've logged, we've grazed intensively, we've changed the cover type by establishing agriculture, stuff like that. And that causes all sorts of issues in the creeks, sedimentation and changes to the hydrology of the landscape. Um, they all have a negative impact on the habitat for the coho.
Well,
Um,
and can you just for folks say, compared to the historic numbers of coho, how many are there in the Russian today or in the last few years?
well, historically, like Alistair said, and throughout the range of the Central Coast, there was probably up to a million fish returning to the streams every year. In the Russian River, I think the estimates were tens to hundreds of thousands of fish every year. In the early 2000s, we were down to single digits,
Right, which is extraordinary.
0 to 10 coho returning to the Russian River watershed every year. And like I said, a lot of this was related to habitat destruction, but there are
Right.
also there are also factors like you put a lot of people on a landscape and people need water. We didn't
Sure.
need water to drink. We grow crops, etc. So we're pulling water out of the creeks and out of the river and out of the watersheds and the aquifers that feed the creeks. So, coho, their life cycle, the juvenile fish hatch in the winter or early spring, excuse me, and they spend the first year of their lives in the creek. And so if the creek doesn't have water when you get into the dry season, then obviously no fish are going to survive.
Well, and we'll get a little more into all of that. I was hoping that you could clarify, and you certainly can too, Sarah, the sort of when we're talking about Coho no longer returning to the Russian, can you clarify the difference between extinction and extirpation for folks?
I think that's a good question for Sarah.
Okay, great.
Yeah,
Excellent.
sure thing, sure thing. Extirpation is in its simplest sense just localized extinction.
Okay.
So around 2000, Fish and Wildlife was doing extensive surveys looking for coho presence in the streams where they historically occupied in the Russian. And there were 32 streams with documented presence of coho, most of them in the lower Russian River watershed because it's redwood dominated, but some in the upper part of the system. Around 2000, as John said, we were only seeing like 2 to 4 fish. One year I think there were 10, but around, I should say, the late 90s through early 2000s, there were just so few fish that it was clear that they were beyond the point where they could recover on their own. They were below depensation thresholds, right? And so, I mean, at this point, fish returning, the few stragglers were unlikely to even find a mate to procreate with, right? I mean, so they were totally aiming towards local extirpation, local
Okay.
extinction without intervention. And then the broodstock program was formed by federal, state, and local resource agencies to really take some of the fish, the remaining fish, which were in very small numbers now in only 2 of those 32 historic streams. Take a portion of those collected in the wild. Most of them came from Green Valley Creek and Forestville, bring them up to the hatchery at Warm Springs and raise them under a conservation hatchery conditions, totally different than a game production hatchery. That program has been ongoing with the first, the idea was to raise the adults or raise the fish to adult age, to spawning age, spawn them in the hatchery, and then release their progeny as juveniles into streams that historically had coho, but not those 2 that still had runs returning to not interfere with any wild runs. So that program has been ongoing with annual stockings and collection, and even some incorporation of Lagunitas Creek genetics over time because the genetic pool was so small, there wasn't enough diversity. And for 20 years now. And now the numbers have been steadily increasing. The estimates of hatchery fish returns really peaked in 2017 and 18, above 750. In recent years, it's looking pretty bleak. This year, last year, as a result of the drought for this year class of fish when they were rearing in the streams, looking really bleak. And overall, I'd say probably around 400 fish on average over the last 10 years returning.
Okay, thanks. So one of the reasons, Bay Nature and Alastair have worked together on this story about coho in the Russian River is because it has received federal money. And that federal money is coming from the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Those 2 big federal bills Bay Nature has been following for almost a year now, specifically looking at that federal money flowing into the Greater Bay Area for nature-related solutions. That's a reporting project we called Wild Billions. So Alastair's piece kind of falls within that reporting project for us. Because it's gotten, the Russian River has gotten some money from those bills for coho restoration. But Sarah, it's super cool to hear that actually those bills are in part why you've come on with NOAA, correct? Okay, and that your work is to look at, among other things, similarly funded projects up and down the coast from Mendocino to Monterey. Did I get that right?
You did,
Okay.
yeah.
Can you say just briefly, just so we step back for 1 second to kind of look at the Central Coast coho population larger than just how it's doing in the Russian River, because these funds are looking at it more holistically, right? And can you just say a little bit about some of those projects?
Yeah, sure. And first of all, just to clarify, yes, absolutely. I'm here because my position was created through these Bill and IRA funds. And really our restoration center through the Office of Habitat Conservation, we manage 4 awards for those funds. I'll tell you a little bit about those, but that money, initially allowed us to really upscale in numbers. Our California office was really quite small, and we were able to hire new people, at least for the duration of these funds. So let's see, there has been, I know your series on Wild Billions is fantastic, and it's a lot to follow because there's money coming through other offices of NOAA. There are money coming to do similar and complementary projects from numerous agencies and entities. But sticking with what we've funded in the first round of funding, so we have 4 award programs, and they're broken down into 2 broader categories. The first is priority barrier removal for fish passage, and the second is transformational habitat restoration and coastal resilience. And then a portion of each of those is broken down to be dedicated specifically to advancing the priorities of tribes and underserved communities, making it then 4 different award programs. So for round 1, through the Office of Habitat Conservation, we awarded 109 grants across the U.S. for $480 million about. California received about close to $52 million in projects. And the Greater Bay Area, if we extend it from, Santa Cruz County all the way up to Mendocino County, including this project that's featured today, close to 29 million worth of funds were received for 5 projects. The 4 additional ones, in addition to the one we'll be discussing in more detail, is an award to the Nature Conservancy for work on coastal Mendocino systems on the 10-mile Navarro and Garcia rivers to reconnect and restore floodplain and stream habitat in high priority reaches of those systems. The Pinoleville Nation in the northern portion of the Russian River watershed was awarded funding to design a plan to reconnect Ackerman Creek, which is a non-Coho bearing, but steelhead bearing stream that runs into the Russian River. This work will allow them to increase their capacity by hiring new staff into their environmental program, and also includes a series of workshops where traditional ecological knowledge will be shared with the community. San Mateo RCD received a pretty substantial award to advance 18 different projects to restore across estuary, stream, and floodplain habitat environments in the Pescadero and San Gregorio Creek watersheds. Trout Unlimited also received funding for Mendocino coast work to specifically remove barriers in the Eel, Noyo, Navarro, and Big Rivers. They're going to be constructing 7 projects, designing 2 more. So I think that's all the 5 of the projects. And then, there's a lot of work going on, and everybody is stretching. Let me tell you, everybody is stretching, because in addition to meeting these habitat restoration objectives, we're asking everybody to have, additional components. We want to see factors that really directly improve community resilience to climate hazards. So all these projects have components that build resiliency into ecosystems and communities, and have additional co-benefits to communities, such as creating jobs and public education and outreach and community engagement and tribal engagement. And I want to make sure and mention that for the Russian River project we're going to be discussing today, the tribal entities involved in this process are the Federated Indian, or are represented, I should say, by the Federated Indians of the Great Rancheria and the Kashaya Band of Pomo Indians of the Stewart's Point Rancheria. So pretty well-rounded projects here.
Thank you. Thank you. When Alastair and I were talking about this project, and he was like, this is really about the Coho, central Coho. Of course, it's not possible to really get at the heart of an issue if you go broad and talk about all of those projects. So for Alastair's piece, we went deep on one, which is I know every project is different, but it would be interesting to hear along the way if what's happening at the Russian River is sort of generally an example of what's happening elsewhere, or if it's unique in particular ways, generally speaking. But so why don't we start in moving back to the Russian River. Alastair, why don't you just talk about kind of the news hook for your piece? Why, what was the grant? What are they for?
Yeah, so the big things start small, and this is 8.4 million. It's maybe a small splash in the whole effort to bring Coho back. Um, it came from, as you mentioned, the bipartisan infrastructure law, which we can just call Bill,
Yeah.
and it comes along with a lot of funding for other coastal streams to restore Coho. So it looks in the big scheme, it's sort of it looks like a real sincere effort going on right now to really try to cast the net wide and restore the habitat. But on the Russian River, it's being focused on two tributary streams, and Willow Creek and Green Valley Atascadero Creek, which is further upstream. Some of the money, and John can certainly talk about this more in detail, but some of the money is, I believe, going to put shovels in the ground on a couple of projects and a couple of spots, and actually physically move move soil around and rock, and change the physical habitat so that the water flows in the way that benefits fish the way that they need it. I think the rest is mostly for planning purposes to sort of plan the next step, and set up recovery for maybe another phase of funding or something. But all in all, I think it's kind of a starting point for recovery.
Okay. And I'd love to hear, John, all the players along the Western River invested in restoration. What can you just say a little bit about why the RCD would be getting this money versus any of those other entities?
Well, we have a long record of working with landowners throughout our district to improve habitat, not just for coho, but for many different species. We've been working on coho salmon probably for over 25 years, and most of that has been directed toward habitat restoration, habitat enhancement. Since most of the Russian River is in private hands, you have to have the ability to work with private landowners. And the RCD is really well positioned with that, because that's essentially our function, is to work with all landowners, but there are a lot of private landowners on natural resource issues.
Yeah. What did I want to ask? So as Alastair couched it, this is a beginning, this money is a beginning, but can you kind of help give a little context around what that means? So how significant or insignificant is this amount of money versus the problem that needs solving?
That's a great question, and I don't think there's a simple answer to it.
No doubt.
For us, it's a very significant amount of money, because it allows us to tackle some of these habitat limitations, as Alastair mentioned, across two different streams, and really have a focused effort on addressing some of these habitat limitations. For us, our overall project encompasses 7 different projects on these 2 creeks, and they are largely aimed at improving floodplain function, so interaction between the creek and the floodplain. Coho, when they're fattening up before they go out to the ocean, they spend the fall, summer, and winter just feasting on bugs and getting ready to go out to the ocean. The bigger they are, the more likely it is they'll return in 2 years to spawn. And so these floodplain areas that flank the streams are really critically important, because they provide this sort of low velocity, very productive habitat where coho can find a lot of food and not have to spend a lot of energy fighting current.
Mhm.
And throughout Lower Willow Creek and Green Valley Atascadero, there's been a lot of work in the past to channelize these streams to make the land that's immediately adjacent to them more suitable for agriculture. And while that was very successful in its time, what it did was it kind of it interrupted the natural process of flooding onto the floodplains, which produces these habitats.
Mhm.
So we're aiming to sort of undo some of that damage and restore some of the processes that have been interrupted by that.
And Sarah, do you want to weigh in on the goal for these funds?
Yeah, definitely. And I'll also point out that another reason that the RCD is really well positioned to receive these funds is because the 2 streams that are the focus of this work have been designated as 2 of the highest priority streams in the Russian River watershed for Central California Coho salmon recovery. So the agencies have a really focused, targeted plan. It's in development now to outline priorities for restoration over the next 10 years, where the funding should be going, in particular state funding through the Department of Fish and Wildlife. And two of these streams they're two of the four outlined in this plan for the Russians. So, and the plan is in draft form now. It hasn't been produced. But anyway, so it's also the priority level of these streams. And I think, more broadly, our goals when we're looking at which projects to fund, because, this is a competitive process, and a lot of really good, well thought out projects that, in my opinion, should be done come through our reviewers. And we have to choose from that. So we're looking for the projects that have the greatest potential in, terms of regional importance, value to salmonids, potential for change to make a meaningful impact to conserving ESA listed fish, right? And then also to contribute to climate resiliency. So that's sort of more broadly, but I think specifically the goals that we want to see through this project are, I guess, like when the funding here is wrapped up, we've got some short-term goals in mind. As John spoke to, those are really about increasing coho and steelhead smolt survival and growth in Green Valley and Willow by reconnecting floodplain and off-channel habitats. And there's potential to do that for, over, I think, 10 acres in each system. These are incredibly valuable habitats. We can get a lot more bang for our buck as compared to other parts of these watersheds. And then another, let's say, kind of immediate goal, because the implementation on it will start this summer, is we want to see improved passage for salmon and steelhead through the valley floor area where fish cannot make it downstream during low flow conditions in Willow Creek. And so that's something we're looking to immediately improve, because we know that is an absolute limiting factor to salmon survival in that system. But then we've got broader long-term goals, and the planning and design portion of this plays into it. I mean, we're really looking to, at the end of this project, have holistic systems-based plans that rely primarily on nature-based solutions to really reinvigorate these high-value wetland complexes in these systems. Not just for salmonids, but for all the native organisms, as well as increasing community resilience to climate change and abating some of the issues around flooding and infrastructure with Willow Creek and Green Valley roads. But we're kind of envisioning that when the funding wraps up, there'll be plans in place that enable the Gold Ridge RCD and other partners to seek implementation funding for shovel-ready projects, which is a lot easier to get, and also for them to have built their capacity organizationally and their level of community engagement required to really kind of launch from there and keep the momentum going on this work, even when federal funds might not be available.
When you talk about some of those early goals and creating the habitat, does that get measured numerically? As in, do you have a target for how many juveniles you see in a season? Or some other?
Yeah, different metrics have different, some of them have quantitative targets. They're based around different things. Some of them are physical habitat characteristic metrics. In the case of let's go back to that. And also hydrologic connectivity metrics, right? Like for floodplain habitat, what are, the as-built elevations and how long and how frequently are these floodplains inundated? So those type of data are collected and submitted so we can track the success of projects. But there's also something pretty cool happening here for the Passage project. It's just really a low-tech approach to improving passage for smolts downstream and even adults upstream through the middle reach of Willow Creek. And it's bounded by pit tag antennas. So the RCD has placed antennas at strategic locations to help really inform how projects are working and immediately adapt to allow for passage. So this whole pit tag monitoring infrastructure is super useful for giving us like real-time information about whether our approaches are working. And then there's also another effort that's happening that complements this, and that is California Sea Grant and UC Berkeley are working together on a research project to really look kind of holistically throughout the system and see how are salmonids using this to employ a diversity of life history strategies. How do they use this habitat or the diversity of habitat available to them across time and space, and how can we maximize those opportunities for them? So it's a cool feedback loop, and the metrics vary by project.
Yeah, yeah, okay. So I mean, we've skipped across and mentioned both of these projects a good bit, but maybe it would be helpful if we just step back for a second, and Alastair, if you could just sort of in broad strokes say what, where is Willow Creek? How big is it? What are the the basic stats about these two different projects for people who aren't as in the know?
Sure, yeah. So as I think both our experts have mentioned, Willow Creek and Green Valley, Atascadero Creek, they're considered the two streams with the highest potential for helping restore Russian River Coho. And Willow Creek, it's starting down toward the ocean. It flows into the Russian from the south, just upstream from the Highway 1 bridge, which a lot of you have probably crossed over. About a half mile. Yeah, just upstream from Jenner, and it drains 9 square miles. And to the untrained eye, to my eye, 9 months ago, it looks like a fairly pristine watershed. There's meadows next to the creek. There's riparian vegetation growing around it, and it flows out of a forested watershed. But John and a colleague took me on a personal tour of it, and they pointed out everything that was wrong with it. The flood, the creek in its lower quarters can't quite reach the floodplain when it really should be reaching the floodplain. It's been channelized, and there's been a road.
Super quickly define what a floodplain is, just for anybody who's not totally up to speed.
Good question. I think I know. It's land usually lower down in the system that's been that gets routinely flooded when the river gets elevated by rainfall, the storm events. The level jumps up and it spreads out over the land adjacent to the creek. And wildlife uses this habitat when it's flooded and when it's wet, and eventually the water retreats again, and then, but it gets routinely flooded. I think that's more or less the definition of a floodplain. Maybe someone
did we get it, John? Does that more or less comport with? Okay.
Yeah, pretty much. That's a pretty good definition.
Okay, cool. So that's roughly where Willow Creek is, and and then specifically what's being proposed there right now, or what's being discussed about what might happen there.
Well, I think John was going over it. Things like addressing there's a big blockage down low where there's sediment that's been washed out from upstream logging scars. It's created this big sediment plug low down or midway down through the system toward the Russian River mouth, or to where it meets the Russian, and it essentially blocks fish from coming upstream and juveniles from going downstream. So that's a major barrier there. And then there's the floodplain connectivity problem. That's Willow Creek. But there's one more thing. There's great potential because there's almost no agricultural development there, very little water diversion, very little development. It's just that the water isn't interacting with the landscape the way it needs to be, but it could be. And so there's a lot of potential to restore Willow Creek. Cool. And then you go upstream 10 or 12 river miles to right around Forestville, and that's where Green Valley Creek enters the Russian from the south. It's bigger. It drains 38 square miles. It comes out of the hills that are south and west of Sebastopol, where there are redwood trees, by no coincidence. And it's also a high potential stream, but it's riddled with problems. So it's really different than Willow Creek. There's lots of water diversions for agriculture. It's been checkerboarded with vineyards and orchards. Vineyards use a fair bit of water. And then roads crisscross it, and they've created blockages and flow problems, and so there's a lot of sediment barriers, again, more migration barriers like on Willow Creek. So lots to be done there, but again, it has high potential.
Great, thank you. So I know we're early days in these two projects, and it would be great, John and Sarah, to hear from both of you sort of what the process is for determining how these projects will unfold.
We've done watershed assessments of both of these creeks, and that's kind of the sort of basic scientific investigation that the projects come from.
Great.
You know, from there we identify specific project sites where we know that there are impairments, that there are limitations to either fish passage or fish survival, or the ability of fish to rear in the creeks and the floodplains. And you know, from there, it's a process of kind of working to identify what's going to work to restore those processes. Once we get to that point, you know, we can actually design a project, and then we go looking for funding to build it. Not sure I was completely clear on what you meant by how they will unfold.
Well, I guess I want to know, are there points along the way where the public can engage with the process and talk about how these solutions get applied?
Yeah, we generally have technical advisory committees that work to help us develop these projects. That's a little bit more specialized in just general public involvement, but part of our process is always to have public meetings where we discuss and describe the work that we've engaged in so far, and talk about the direction that the project planning and project design is taking. We want to get public input on these projects. We want people to be completely informed on, you know, what the goals are and what the outcome is likely to be.
Yeah. I'll just add a little bit if we have time.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, and especially, as John was saying, especially for community members that will be directly affected, you know, by this work. Like, some of this work is focused around, you know, solutions to address the flooding around Green Valley Creek Road that impacts hundreds of people. But in general, you know, public engagement is highly supported, and there's money built into funding for that. So just to you know, just to kind of let you know that John made it sound a little bit like easy, even though he outlined it well. But I want to make clear that these projects build on 10 to 20 years of data collection, investigations into geomorphological characteristics, hydrological characteristics, pretty fine scale fish and environmental data, historical ecology studies, processes such as that salmonid habitat restoration priorities process that I mentioned, where the agencies engage with the public and experts to really like pinpoint priorities, not just where problems such as, you know, limiting factors to fish survival exist, but you know, where are the priorities? Where do we start? And to outline those projects. So it's a really intensive. Then there's a lot of back and forth through every design phase, or every stage of the project. Really, there's engagement of a whole panel of experts through these TACs or working groups. So we're really building on a huge effort. Like, this funding is coming in to really upscale it, but it started long before this, and it's been really rich, and a lot of partners have invested heavily in it for decades now.
And we have a lot of really great questions, so I want to move to that quickly. But I just want to give everybody a chance to speak to kind of one of the bigger questions, which is, okay, Coho numbers have really, really dropped over decades, and we're talking about it now. We're projects are happening up and down the coast. But so Alastair, in your reporting, what did you come across in terms of sentiments or thoughts about whether Coho can rebound? You're muted, Alastair.
Thank you. everyone's hopeful. Everyone's hopeful, and it seems like we're our hearts are in the right place, and we're trying to do. We're at least, so right now we're talking about taking the right actions. But uh, the thing about these recovery goals is they're kind of disorienting. It's 50 to 100 years out that's the target for bringing these to recovering Coho. So we won't even know if it happens, and it's easy for us to say we're going to do it because we won't be held accountable. Our generation won't. So yeah, we're talking a long ways away. Hard to know where the world's going to be, or Willow Creek or Green Valley Creek in 100 years.
Yeah.
Uh, One of my sources, Jacob Katz, with California Trout, put it real nicely. Well, he thinks we have the information, we can do it. We know the code for recovery. We just have to punch in the numbers. We know how to do it though. We know the problems, and he likened the problem to a lock and key problem. The evolutionary key of the Coho no longer fits into the lock of the watershed, and we need to fix the lock because we've broken it. And if we can fix it, then they can get in again. They can utilize the watershed. Peter Moyle, UC Davis, fish biologist, renowned for decades. He's also a source in the story. He feels keeping Coho alive in the future is going to be an uphill push, kind of a labor of love with a lot of hands-on maintenance of the fish, and taking care of the habitat, giving them rides in trucks, hatchery production, and even then, having abundant salmon runs might not be possible. He said we might have boutique salmon runs in the future that will be tourist attractions, but not very maybe ecologically or economically significant. So, hard to know, but it seems 50-50.
John, Sarah, who wants to go next? How do you respond to that?
I agree with Alastair, and this is something I always try to emphasize. This is a long-term process. I think that we do have a pretty good understanding of what the limitations are for Coho to be in a self-sustaining, thriving population. It's a matter of the will and the ability to address those limiting factors. I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, and maybe I'll just add, as Alastair, alludes to in his article, like, we're here at the southern range of the Coho's native habitat, and we're dealing with increasing climate volatility. So it really doesn't bode well for the fish that, just are at the southern warmest range anyway, or end of the range. I mean, it feels like we're clinging to life here. These fish are barely scraping by in the Russian with the support of a conservation hatchery program. What if that program weren't here? So, I think these are really serious questions that we ask ourselves a lot. Regardless, I feel that we're obliged to try and to do our best. These are super critical keystone species. Also, if we can't manage to recover Coho here at the southern end of their range, I think, well, there's some really good signs on the Mendocino coast of increasing numbers over the last 15 years that really correspond to restoration efforts. So that's kind of a hopeful, model of improvement, habitat restoration leading to population improvements, in my opinion. I don't know that it's been put that way, but we're really seeing these positive trends. But either way, if we can't recover the Coho here, I'm absolutely convinced that every single action we take is helping to support all of the remaining organisms that naturally occur in these ecosystems, right? And I think two of those key ones are steelhead, who now are threatened and occur in greater numbers currently. They're also struggling quite a bit, but they occur in greater numbers than Coho, and they're much more flexible and adaptable. They can manifest different life history strategies. They can tolerate warmer temperatures, lower dissolved oxygen. So, and they also provide the same ecosystem service of bringing nutrients back and fertilizing our watershed. So steelhead, and then I say human beings. I mean, we absolutely rely on the freshwater resources in and underlying these stream and river systems for our literal survival, right? As well as the other natural processes that we're working to restore, because when they're functioning properly, we get increased climate resiliency. They buffer extreme weather events for us. They sequester carbon. They clean our air, support a whole suite of native organisms, wildlife, birds, plants, provide opportunities for recreation, connecting to nature. overall, all this work ultimately will contribute to a better life for all of us, right? Enriching our physical, emotional well-being and the health of our ecosystem. So that's what keeps me going, even when the numbers look bleak.
Thanks. And with that, we're going to move to some of our Q&A, because we have a lot of good questions. And actually, the one at the top of the list, how did the low numbers of the fish in the early 2000s affect the ecosystem of the river? I feel like, Sarah, you just touched on that a little bit, but maybe not quite so specific a question.
I think there were so many impacts kind of culminating at the same time, all these cumulative impacts of the legacy of destructive land use practices for so many years that by the time, the nail was in the coffin, I think with building the two major dams in the Russian River watershed, there had already been so much damage and so much impact to their habitat that it's hard to tease apart the effects, right? But I sometimes wonder, are all of the things that are plaguing our trees, sudden oak death, madrone canker, and these types of things related to the fact that we no longer have tens to hundreds of thousands of salmon coming in and fertilizing these trees and allowing them to grow bigger and stronger and supporting greater biomass in these watershed ecosystems that relied on this over evolutionary time as a source of nutrition and strength, right? I can't help but wonder. I haven't heard anybody prove it, but I think it's really deep, and we can't even fathom all the impacts. But our watersheds are starved. Yeah.
We have a good question from Tim Daniels. This is like almost a whole other webinar, but so even with habitat restoration, won't drought and warmer temperatures make the habitat unsuitable? The sea grant work went on for years and nothing seemed to make a difference. You might have to give a little context, whoever would like to take that.
Well, climate change is definitely going to be another challenge. In addition to warmer temperatures, what's kind of projected for the changing climate in our region is that not necessarily that we'll be drier or wetter, but that we're going to see more extremes. So more drought years, more really wet years, more large storms, and all those are challenges for fish that live in these small creeks. I don't know that I would go so far as to say that would make the habitat unsuitable. If you start looking at the factors that we can control for human water use and how we, drain our watersheds and how we arrange the impervious surfaces and how we manage forests and how we manage agricultural and wildlands, I think there's a lot of work that can be done there that, will offset some of these potential impacts of climate change. Like Sarah said, I think that we have a moral and ethical obligation to do what we can to undo some of the damage that we've done and to try to account for future, challenges. So there's a lot of work we can do that's sort of apart from climate change, and hopefully we'll be able to allow for, the changes that will come with the changing climate.
Let's see, I'm looking at some other questions here. Alec Howell asks, what are the chances of the state or a conservation organization acquiring more land from private owners near the mouth of the Russian to increase forage habitat for juveniles?
I don't know that that's necessary.
Okay, yeah, it's a very specific question.
Willow Creek, for example, is right near the mouth of the Russian and is largely in state park control right now, which allows us to do some of these projects a little bit more easily. At the mouth of the Russian River estuary, there's a lot of restoration work that could happen there because, like all estuaries, it's kind of been filled in by sediment and greatly simplified over the years. Having the state own more land at the Russian River estuary, having a conservation organization own more land there would definitely make it easier to implement some of these projects. But I don't see the ownership necessarily as being an impediment to implementing habitat enhancement and restoration efforts at the mouth of the Russian.
We have some kind of pointed questions also from Nona Dennis. Nona, nice to hear from you. What is the condition of spawning gravels in Willow and Green Valley?
You want to take that one, Sarah?
Willow's really interesting because, I mean, there are so many years of major logging in the upper watershed that and it's just an incredibly erodible geology. So there's really mobile sediment loads. So gravel is coming in from the headwaters, moving through the system, and there's some nice spawning gravels being captured, especially after some large woody material was installed to help, you know, sort and recruit some of those gravels. There's definitely going to be more opportunity for that, I think, as part of this master plan. So yes, they could use some improvement. There is some spawning habitat there. You know, with everything, I think it's kind of a triage thing with the state of our streams. And right now, if we can get fish moving through that center reach of Willow and get them to the spawning gravels, then we can put more focus on the spawning gravels. You know, there's also a lot of fines coming in, but areas where wood is sorting, those is doing pretty well. So yeah, we need more wood, and that's going to be part of this bigger project. Green Valley, we could use, I mean, there's also some limitations around spawning gravel, but there's a lot of spawning relative to other systems that's happening, successful spawning in Green Valley Creek. So it could be better. It's not the biggest limiting factor to that system. So we're going to work on some of these other things, you know, like the wetland complex, and you know, reconnecting some floodplain habitat, because we've got this deeply incised system that's completely connected from floodplain. It's floodplain. So we have no riverscape. We've just got like an incised channel there. So I'd say that takes priority over the need for spawning gravels at this time in that system. Not that it couldn't use some love there, but it's not the highest priority, in my opinion.
We got a question from Doug Titus. Are recent findings on contamination from tire chemicals impacting coho salmon? Is that a problem in the Russian Willow, Green Valley Creek watersheds? So tire pollution.
Can I give it a try?
Yeah.
I actually asked one of my sources about this, and it was his explanation, which makes a lot of sense to me now. That this is more an urban area problem. It's not that there's not a lot of cars on the roads that are here in these the watersheds that we're talking about, but the road density is so slight compared to urban areas where there's just the acreage of roads. I don't even know, but it's just how to measure it. But there, the contribution of those of that kind of contamination to the watersheds is many times greater in the urban areas where there's these dense road networks than in more rural areas. So I'm pretty sure that this is not a major problem in the system that we're talking about. But maybe I need some editing or correcting by one of the experts.
I'll just say it's good to have on our radar, but from somebody who's monitored fish populations in those systems for a number of years, we've not seen signs of problems with that. Good to have on our radar. It's another thing we should all be aware of and push for changing manufacturing criteria and chemical allowance and everything, but we haven't seen any signs it's impacting fish in those systems.
So as we start to wrap up here, what I really want to hear a little bit about is how can the public engage in the process going forward around these two restoration areas? Where can they get more information if they want to get more educated, and how can they engage constructively? John, take it away.
I think that education is going to be the linchpin of that. You know,
Yeah.
and you can find a lot of information places like our website, but just being aware of the conditions in your own watershed where you live. Seek out the organizations that are doing work to restore or to enhance ecological function and to bring back fish. You'll find that there's a lot of information out there. and educating yourself will lead to the next step, which is figuring out how you can support those efforts. You know, the biggest sort of stumbling block we always run into is that there's limited funding for all of this. There's a huge problem out there on the landscape, and we're applying for grants, you know, one at a time to address a problem here or address a problem there. Public support for restoration efforts goes a really long way towards ensuring that, you know, state, federal, and even local, you know, county government will provide resources to try to address some of these problems.
Public support is also the only way we get out there to, you know, assess and work in these watersheds. The Russian River watershed is somewhere around 90% privately owned. So
Mm.
all this work relies on literally thousands of landowners offering their permission to grant people access to go out on their properties, which is amazing. There's incredible community support. So that cannot be dismissed as like a huge contributor to the success of these types of efforts. And then I'll say this is a really hard question because I always want to say, oh, you can get involved this way and have people really feel like they can make a meaningful contribution. But the way that a lot of this happens, and it's just kind of a functional necessity, I guess, is it's just an organizational process kind of. But as John said, like connecting to local groups that are doing this work, I don't know if I'm allowed to like mention any because
Yeah,
I'm not
yeah.
endorsing any, but like there are local chapters of, you know, John, a board that John sits on that people can be involved in. I also know there's a Green Valley Watershed Council. The folks in that are working really hard to stay connected and educated and contribute to restoration in that watershed. I think some of them are probably on this call today. So yeah, connecting there. And, you know, I'm always happy if somebody wants to reach out to get in the weeds on that a little more.
And Alastair, did you in your reporting come across any sort of ways that you saw people getting engaged that seemed particularly accessible?
Unless I'm totally forgetting something, I don't know. I don't think I went
Yeah.
that direction in my reporting. I'm just trying to remember now. No.
Okay. Yeah. No pressure. No pressure. But and if we have links, let's see, links to share. We will also send these out in our follow-up emails, so people will get a few resources where they can learn more. And of course, I encourage everybody to read Alastair's story on baynature.org if you haven't already. And with that, we are going to begin to wrap up here. So I really just want to say thank you to our panelists for spending the time to prepare for this and then to be with us today to talk about this. Sarah, thank you for joining us, and really wonderful to meet you.
Thank you for having me. It's been my pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. And
Thank you
likewise,
for your great coverage, by the way, of all things
yeah.
environmental in the Bay Area.
Oh, thank you. And likewise, John, I'm always a huge fan of RCDs and want more people to know the great work that they're doing. It's such a fascinating entity to me. So thank you for making time today.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. And Alastair, last but not least, thank you for all your work on this. This was a big project, and we really look forward to the next story you do for Bay Nature.
Yeah, thank you. So do I.
Okay. All right. Take it easy.
Bye.
And to everybody else, thank you again for joining us today. And in the coming days, you'll get an email from us with a link to this, link to the recording, link to places where you can get a little more information. And thanks for joining, and we'll see you next time.